On the day when a stench of wet straw and rotten flesh invaded the papal chambers, Cardinal Oriani ordered the curtains to be drawn and no light to be let in. "Let him rot in the dark like a saint on earth," he whispered, and crossed himself with his left hand. The servants bringing the poppy root broth had long since stopped looking up. The smell in the room where the Pope was dying enveloped everything: the curtains, the sacred books, the golden cross on his chest. Even the air in the rooms had become thick, like the broth spilled on the floor. The last weeks of the pontiff's life, the seventh to bear that name, were not recorded in the official chronicle or in the letters of the Curia, but in the archives of the monastery of San Giovanni. There is a notebook stained with soot and grease belonging to the novice Domenico, who, on the orders of his superiors, was taken at night to serve at the dying man's bedside. He whispered unknown words and his fingers were cold as copper. His nails were blackened. He did not ask for candles, but for ashes. He drank water, but it came back through his skin. The doctors, called from Siena, remained silent. One of them, an old man named Guido, insisted that he be bled. They cut his veins every day. The blood came out dark and bubbly. Only those who no longer feared blasphemy or curses remained in the room. Two brothers who were doctors, who had arrived from the south, refused to enter on the third day, and only a brief sentence remained in Archbishop Capello's report. The Pope is losing his skin and his speech. His breath is like the smoke of burning wool. His eyes are cloudy and mobile. At first, it was hoped that the illness was a simple fever, but after the seventh day it became clear. The body was not only rotting, but was ceasing to belong to a human being. The skin on his shoulders peeled off when his shirt was changed. Larvae moved under his fingernails. There was grey-green foam on his lips. With each breath, a hissing sound could be heard, as if someone were grinding ashes under his skin. But the worst thing was that the Pope kept talking, silently, nonsensically. Sometimes he blessed the air, sometimes he scratched the sheet, on which stains that looked like letters were imprinted. The secretary of the Curia, a Kelly, wrote everything down in his diary. The clock stopped when, at noon, he began to laugh. Time stood still in the rooms, the candles did not burn, the wine did not cool, and the shadows crept upward. One of the monks, upon entering in the morning, was paralyzed. In a corner was a figure, covered with a black cloth. No one knew who had placed it there. The figure disappeared the next day. Along with it, two servants. Protopresbyter Juan de Torres, who in his youth had been an anatomist in Murcia, tried to investigate the causes of the illness. He prescribed hot poultices of sulfur and vinegar, egg and ash ointments for the Pope, and ordered the rooms to be fumigated with juniper smoke. Nothing worked. In a treatise found among his papers after his death, it was written, "He is bleeding with black air. It is not blood, it is not mucus, it is smoke that lives in his lungs." The Pope, or what was left of him, asked for confession, but did not allow any priests to enter. When the nuns of the Congregation of Mercy tried to enter with their prayers, one of them fainted from the stench. Another began to convulse, and according to the testimony of the Inquisitor Brandoni, to shout from memory prayers forbidden in Trent. Later, she was found in a well, with her tongue torn out. When the Pope was given opium, he smiled but continued to breathe heavily, his larynx squeaking. His lips were cracked, his gums blackened, and his belly so swollen that his shirt had torn at the seams. Black grease oozed from her ears and a cloudy liquid from her eyes, as if they were melting from within. The priest Cassio, called to absolve her, refused to enter, saying, "There is no soul in these rooms, only the remains of a body full of evil." The guards stood at the door. The passage to the apostolic chambers was closed. The documents noted, "Entry only with the seal of blood." No one explained whose blood it was or where it had been deposited. Meanwhile, behind the doors, another movement began. One of the most senior cardinals had already prepared a decree for the temporary transfer of power. Another called for an envoy from Venice, supposedly to discuss the upcoming ecclesiastical council, but the servants heard arguments and fighting. One of them, who fled through the kitchen corridor, later recounted under torture. The keys and gold were distributed while the pontiff was still alive, but no longer breathing. The servants covered the mirrors. One of them, a young monk named Raffaele, wrote, "I saw his reflection, and he was breathing faster than himself. Then the mirror darkened. I didn't look again." The next day, Raffaele disappeared. His name was erased from the Brotherhood's book. On the 16th night, only a surgeon named Leone remained in the room. He was later interrogated, and his body was found in the basement, wrapped in cloths soaked in bile. Only one line remained in his notes. He asked to be cut in the shape of a cross so that he could breathe. And only then did they make up their minds. At dawn, 3 people entered the chambers: the doctor, the surgeon, and the deacon brother. They laid the Pope back down. His body was stiff but warm. They cut his skin from his shoulders to his abdomen, and from his sternum to his pubis. The cross. At that moment, a gasp was heard. Black vapor came out of the incision. His lungs did not empty, but spilled out like sacks of ashes. One of the surgeons began to scream. Another lost consciousness. The deacon prayed. The wind blew into the room through the open windows, and the candles went out. Dad was dead, but it became more difficult to breathe in the rooms. A sweet smell of rot came from the rooms, permeating the curtains, carpets, and stone walls themselves. It did not dissipate even when the windows were thrown wide open, and the nuns, with their dark headscarves, fumigated the rooms with burning herbs and incense. Moans filtered through the cracks in the doors. Muffled, hoarse, interrupted by long, convulsive breaths. The Pope no longer recognized faces. The servants who entered his chambers with decoctions of ground bark, opium tincture, or a basin to vomit into, noticed that he was talking to empty corners, moving his hands in the air as if he were feeling someone's invisible face. Several times he called for long-dead cardinals, ordering them to cleanse the chair of the impure. A hospital monk's record from the 5th day reads, "He spoke in a sing-song voice, without apparent logic. His body trembled. His tongue had turned black, and his lips were covered with ulcers. He had not urinated for 2 days, and his belly was swollen like that of a leper." The chief court physician, Brother Conrad, refused to continue the bloodletting, for the black blood no longer flowed, but only oozed like coagulated juice. After this, he was replaced by a famous surgeon from southern Campania named Pedro el Blanco. He demanded daily cleaning of the body with citric acid and rubbing of the groin with a paste of ground cumin, vinegar, and grouse bile. There was no improvement. The purulent coating on his tongue turned greenish, his nails blackened and began to fall off. And at night, his body writhed in convulsions. Dad screamed several times, He asked for shackles to prevent the demons from lifting him out of bed and throwing him through the walls. According to the recollections of the waiter Girolamo, who served 3 popes, he knew he was dying, but he did not ask for salvation, only for respite. He asked for his fever to be lowered with chains so that he would not have dreams. He said that Satan would appear to him in a cloud of white flies and tear his lungs out with the flesh. And one night, he cried out, "They're here. I can hear the buzzing of their wings under my skin." By then, almost all those close to him had been expelled from his inner circle. Of the 7 closest advisors, only 2 remained: Cardinal Manuel, his former personal confessor, and the prior of Orvieto, a brusque and taciturn man who kept himself aloof from the general commotion. Rumors circulated that it was he who had arranged for the medicines to be changed in the first weeks of the illness. The court servants, who were responsible for the morning cleaning of the utensils and clothes, claimed that there was too much red in the ointments and drinks they brought him, as if they had added a lamb's heart. An archival note from a palace report on behalf of the Chamberlain, unsigned but stamped with a dog's head, states his food was served to him only by a woman, a nun with a white scarf and hands that smelled of resin. She did not utter a word, only bowed to him, and he thanked her many times for the honey, for the tea, for the water. Once he said to her, "If you are poison, I am yours to the end. Don't leave until the black smoke rises." His bed was changed twice a day, but the mattresses were so soaked that they had to be burned. His face was swollen, his eyelids stuck together, and between spasms, he breathed with difficulty, as if he had water accumulated in his chest. In the 7th week of the illness, Dad stopped eating. They fed him through a thin goat horn inserted into the corner of his mouth. His lips were already cracked, with threads of pus coming out of them. From the junior pharmacist's note, the urine is black. The stools are foul-smelling and resinous. It smells like rotten cloth and iron. There seems to be something moving in the chest. Bubbling sounds can be heard. The lungs are probably decomposing. After this note, the pharmacist was forbidden to approach the body. He was taken to the monastery's underground chambers and never came out again. Security was tightened. Even the cardinals had to write their requests on parchment and send them by messenger. Anyone who entered the Pope's chambers without permission never came out again. According to rumors, the bodies of 2 hospitable brothers were found in the basement with their eyes burned out. This was later denied, but the fear remained. The pontiff's rooms became inaccessible. Iron bolts and amulets sewn with rat skin were placed on the doors. No one heard his voice again. Only a nun, who brought him food and ointments, entered the darkness. She did not wear a cross. No one remembered her name. When his body could no longer be supported on the throne, the servants placed 2 rolled-up carpets soaked in rose water at his sides. He could not lie down. His chest seemed to be rotting from the inside, and when he bent forward even slightly, air came out of his mouth, with a gurgling sound impregnated with pus. His lips were cracked, and his tongue so swollen that the priest, called to give him communion, did not know if the pontiff was repeating the prayer or writhing in pain. Blue veins stood out on his forehead, throbbing like live worms, and his skull seemed about to split open. On the 7th day of the month, his body was covered with ulcers from which a black liquid oozed. The doctors, who took turns every 3 hours, applied ointments made from vinegar, goat's blood, and crushed juniper. But it was all in vain. One of the doctors, who was already elderly, suggested cutting the skin in the collarbone area to release the vapors of the plague, as described in a treatise by the Frankish physician William. After the operation, Dad lost consciousness, and rumors spread through the rooms that he had no more than 2 days to live. The rooms had to be reupholstered, as the previous fabric had absorbed the odors, which caused the guards to vomit during the night. One of the reports by the captain of the Papal Guard stated, "The smell is putrid and repulsive, like that of a stable where sick pigs are dying, but with a mixture of incense and something acidic and pungent that irritates the throat and makes the eyes water." The Pope spoke less and less in those days, but prayed more often and in a lower voice. His hands constantly clutched a wooden cross covered with pus-filled spots. He refused food and drank only warm goat's milk, to which, on the orders of his personal physician, a powder made from a mixture of poppy and clay was added. Sometimes he thought he heard someone scratching the walls with their fingernails, and he ordered the nuns to be called to sprinkle the walls with holy water. The inner courtyard of the palace was filled with whispers. Some said that the wine in the cellars had turned black, others that several white doves had flown in through the window of the room and fallen dead instantly. At night, footsteps could be heard in the empty corridor, and then the guards, seized by panic, would run out and drop the lamps. According to the scribe, one of the youngest servants screamed and threw himself into the fountain, claiming to have seen a shadow resembling a crucified man, but without eyes, coming out of the window of the Pope's chambers. The bishop, who was responsible for correspondence, brought letters every night for the kings of France and Aragon for the Pope to sign. The pontiff's signature was shaky, bloody, and sometimes almost illegible. One of the letters was written entirely with the words "pro culpa" repeated 47 times. The next morning, the Pope did not recognize his chamberlain, and snatching the basin of water from his hands, spilled it on the floor, shouting that it was poison brought by order of a black woman. Meanwhile, in the dim light of the chapel, the dispute between two groups of cardinals continued. One insisted that the will be made public as soon as possible. The other, that all the doors of the palace be closed until the Pope's death. Both sides sent their men to the apartments, bribing the guards and servants. According to rumors, one of the servants was caught with a parchment on which the order of the words in a sentence had been changed, and the name Juan had been added. He was beaten to death in the stables, and his body thrown into a well. As night fell, the Pope began to rave again. He shouted, "They are roasting me like a dog, like a dog, like a dog," and demanded to be wrapped in ice. The doctors brought 3 buckets of crushed ice from the cellars, but he rejected them and demanded that the ice be from the well where they threw the babies. One of the surgeons later said, "That night, he spoke to the dead as if he himself were already dead, but the body was still breathing." In the morning, one of the cardinals tried to enter the chambers alone, but was stopped by the guards. His face was flushed, he was trembling, the report reads, and he kept repeating that he had to hear the last words. He was not allowed to enter. Half an hour later, the pontiff seemed to have calmed down. He ordered his body to be lifted, brought his lips to the rim of the cup of wine, took a sip, and exhaled. Then he collapsed onto the pillows, and a bubble of dirty air came out of his mouth. One of the servants fainted, but the pontiff did not die. He simply fell back into a state of unconsciousness. The body continued to exude a black liquid. The servant noted, "The skin between his ribs turned black. When they lifted him up, a layer came off, as if he were a leper. I turned and heard someone whisper that this was how souls rejected by God rotted. When the incense reserves in the apostolic treasury began to run out, the bodyguards, fearing poisoning, refused to enter the chamber without resin and vinegar. The leather masks soaked in vinegar and aloe did not protect them from the stench. On the floor, between the icon of Saint Agatha and the pontiff's own swollen knees, a stain of ink formed, a liquid that flowed from his decomposing lungs. They collected it in bowls and poured it into a pit for lepers. The Pope had not spoken for 3 days. Sometimes he moved his lips like a fish stranded on the shore. His tongue was cracked, and sores covered it. He no longer recognized Cardinal Camerlengo and showed his black gums when he saw his confessor. Only once, raising himself on his elbows, did he whisper, "Take the north wind away from me." He speaks Hebrew, and this was noted in the report of the physician Cesare Salviati as a symptom of spiritual exhaustion and brain poisoning. At dawn on the 5th day, the Pope began to emit a dry, hoarse sound, similar to the squeaking of wheels on cobblestones. The monks entered cautiously with a censer, but one of them, Brother Paolo, fainted. He was taken out and not allowed to approach the dying man again. The doctors insisted on another bloodletting. They opened a vein on the inside of his thigh. The blood flowed slowly, almost like syrup. It was thick, with a mixture of dark green flakes. The surgeon, Taddeo Fossati, noted in his records, "Pus in the blood. The system is breaking down. The liver is completely black." Rumors of his death spread even before it occurred. At the gates of the Vatican were the ambassadors of Naples, France, and the Empire. The Spanish clergy were already preparing a message proposing the Bishop of Avila as his successor. Meanwhile, security measures were being reinforced in the papal chambers. The guard was changed, and access was only allowed with 3 signatures. Even the cardinals were called in one at a time. On the night of the 9th, the Pope became agitated again. He shouted in Latin, alternating fragments of psalms with incomprehensible phrases. He called for the nun who had served him drinks during the last few weeks. Her name was Beatrice, and she had disappeared 2 days earlier. Her room was sealed off. Some wrote that she had been found dead by the river with her throat cut, others that she had been secretly taken to a convent in the north. Statement from the kitchen maid: "His Holiness demanded to drink only from her hands. We brought him wine, but he just stared until she arrived. She would rub the rim of the cup with some kind of oil, and then he would drink. Even when he vomited blood, he thanked her with his eyes. He believed she would not let him die. When the 10th morning came, his fingers turned black. The tips began to fall off, as if they were frozen. The veins on his forehead swelled and remained tense, like ropes. His eyes sank, and a liquid oozed from them. It became increasingly difficult to touch his body. The skin came off, even with the slightest touch. Monk Tommaso's note: "He no longer looked like a human being, just a skeleton, covered in flesh that seemed to want to fall off. He was delirious and moaning. We couldn't tell if he was still alive or had already been punished. In the early afternoon, the body began to emit a constant moan, not from the lips, but from within. The gas accumulated in the decomposing lungs escaped through the airways and vibrated in the larynx. The cardinals who were present moved away toward the door. One of them, according to witnesses, covered his ears and whispered, 'This is how Satan screams when he comes out.' Later, the surgeons found a black ring on the lower abdomen. the mark of an old ulcer that had opened inward. It gave off a putrid odor. Beneath it was a bag of pus. When it was opened, a liquid flowed out, in which white, viscous flakes floated, decomposing internal tissues. The surgeon who was present wrote, "It was not blood or pus. It was death in its purest form. A mucus in which bones and soul disappeared." Soon the gag reflex began, but the stomach was already empty. Instead of food, a green clot came out that smelled of dead fish and arsenic. One of the young doctors ran out of the room unconscious. Dad was still breathing, but his breathing became shallow. Each inhalation was accompanied by a hissing sound, each exhalation by a crackling sound. His chest rose with difficulty, like that of a person drowning in mud. His last movement was to try to cross himself, but his fingers did not close, and his hand fell. Death came at sunset, at 5 o'clock sharp, but they left the body there for several more hours, afraid to approach it. From the 3 rooms adjoining the papal apartments, 8 people were taken out in the morning. 3 had died, and 5 remained silent and refused to eat. All of them had served the Pope in his last days, had touched his sheets, cleaned the pus from his back, and listened to his delirium. According to the notes of the Chancellery notary, 2 of them had to have their hair and nails cut because they were covered with black spots and were trembling from internal heat. They were isolated in the old basement of the liturgical archive, where bone relics were once kept. From there, moans began to be heard at night. Pope Innocent lay motionless, but with his eyes open. He whispered the same thing over and over again. "Don't let them open me up. Don't let them see my lungs." On the 3rd day, 4 surgeons and the cardinal entered with the seal key. According to the report of the ambassador from Paris, the flesh under His Holiness's ribs had turned black as ash and made a wet sound when pressed lightly. One of the doctors recoiled when air escaped from under the skin. The skin on his neck peeled away like parchment, and through a crack in the bandage on his thigh, a thick mixture of pus, blood, and yellow water oozed out, smelling like an old crypt. As one of the servants noted, the windows of his chambers were nailed shut from the outside. The glass was fogged up, dripping onto the stone floor, and the drops mixed with the pus and ran toward the threshold. The monks on guard refused to stand watch at the doors, claiming that at night they heard a cough that could not have come from a living being. One of the brothers, named Guido, wrote in his notebook, "When I pressed my ear to the door, it seemed to me that someone inside was calling my name in the voice of my mother, who had died 8 years ago." On the 6th day, the Pope began to vomit black mucus. When they tried to sit him up, the bones in his hip joint cracked and shifted. It turned out that some of his ligaments had broken down. He had no pulse. Cardinal Lorenzo insisted that the room be blessed immediately. A group of nuns from the order that cared for lepers was invited. When one of them cleaned the pontiff's lips with rose water, his eyes rolled back and something green came out of his nose. She fainted, and 2 senior inquisitors carried her out of the room, leaving a handkerchief on the floor which they were unable to clean, as the stain was impossible to remove, and they burned it. The next day, 3 of the cardinals demanded that the rooms be sealed. But an hour before, the Pope, without moving or opening his eyes, spoke. He pronounced the names of 7 people, 3 of whom had died more than 20 years earlier, and 4 of whom were outside Rome. He then began to whisper verses in Latin that neither the priests nor the notaries knew. Some took it as heresy. Cardinal Domenico wrote, "He cursed the sun, called light pus, and himself a vessel of decay, worthy of being poured into the veins of the church." On the 8th day, the body began to crack at the joints. When they tried to turn him over to treat him, a piece of skin the size of a palm came off the shoulder blade. Underneath was flesh that had already turned dark blue. The doctors argued. Some said it was a rare form of internal putrefaction. Others that the body had been poisoned with a slow-acting compound. One of the reports, transmitted by a secret channel to France, clearly states it is possible that the poison was introduced into the daily drops administered to him by one of the nuns with her finger. Her name does not appear in the records, but later, according to the cook's testimony, her hands were stained as if with ointment, and her voice was too deep for a woman. The Pope did not eat during those days. Everything that touched his lips came out. His teeth began to loosen and fall out one by one. On the 10th day, his jaw was partially exposed and the skin on his chin had come off. That day, the surgeons insisted on performing a preliminary autopsy. Without opening the chest, they inserted a probe between the ribs and pulled it out, covered in a black, foul-smelling liquid. One of them disappeared later, another went mad, and the third wrote, "There was no blood inside, only stench and decay." By nightfall, the smell was so strong that employees from the neighboring gallery were evacuated, and 3 guards refused to change shifts, claiming that someone was crying from inside the hallway. Religious services in the Sistine Chapel were cancelled. The sparrows disappeared from the balconies, and when one of the cleaners tried to burn the stained sheet, it would not catch fire, only smouldering slowly, giving off a blackish smoke that smelled of bitter herbs. On the 11th day, the body stopped decomposing, but not because it had stopped decomposing. The flesh became hard and brittle, and the fingers of the right hand curled inward as if they had contracted in a final convulsion. From the diary of Dr. Tommaso, his nails turned black and curved, as if the whole body were resisting death. But from within, the lungs no longer breathed, but they continued to emit a moist, hissing sound, as if someone was still whispering under the skin. No one left the rooms. Only one nun remained at the door, the same one from before. She was silent. When asked how he was, she replied, "He is grateful." 3 days after his death, the body had not yet cooled. The servants complained of steam coming from the abdomen, of a sound like boiling milk under the skin. On the 5th day, the guards closed the east wing of the Vatican Palace, as a nauseating stench was coming from the cracks in the doors, and several medical brothers lost consciousness when they entered the room. Rumors spread among the Italian cardinals that the body was rotting from the inside, but could not be opened, and many insisted that it be cremated immediately. However, the decision to open and embalm the remains prevailed in order to keep up appearances before the ambassadors. The autopsy began 9 days after his death. The surgeons who had arrived from Siena and Bologna wore tunics soaked in vinegar and breathed through sponges dipped in incense. The incision was made in the shape of a cross, from the shoulders to the groin, and then along the chest and abdomen. As soon as the blade touched the thick skin of the chest, a smell of rotten flesh filled the room. According to the testimony of the chief physician, Vittorio del Frate, the flesh came off with a crack, as if a rotten intestine had burst. The black lungs came out of the chest cavity like heavy cabbages. One of the assistants recoiled and screamed. Grey, hard clots protruded from the lung tissue, looking like stones or horns. The stomach was swollen, filled with semi-digested mucus mixed with blood. The heart was black and bloody, soft and easily broken when touched. White spots were found on the liver, which later treatises would describe as islands of rot in the water of the body. One of the surgeons, according to the records of the notary Cavalli, fell to his knees and began to whisper a prayer. He was convinced that the devil had taken possession of the body of the deceased. The second fled the room and was later found dead next to a fountain, presumably from asphyxiation. The third, Antonio Neri, soon went mad and wrote in his notes that there was a snake in the lungs, but it disappeared before dawn. After the autopsy, the body was not suitable for embalming. Resin dripped from the decomposing flesh without being absorbed. Incense and myrrh charred the skin. The only solution was to seal the body in a lead sarcophagus without a funeral. The ceremony was held without opening the coffin, as was done with lepers. The reaction in Rome was one of panic. The people murmured, "The Pope died because he knew sins he could not forgive." The French ambassador wrote in a report that the court considered his death divine punishment for trying to ban the translation of the prayers. German monks said he was infected from within and poisoned by fear. After the funeral, there was a power vacuum. The conclave of cardinals was postponed. Some bishops did not want to enter the room, which still smelled of decay. Several librarians burned the manuscripts signed by the deceased, for fear of contracting the disease through the word. 3 other servants, who had been in contact with the corpse, died. Rumors of a curse began to spread, and a prayer against the Black Breath spread among the people. Letters found in the monastery of San Stefano 2 years later confirm that 2 weeks before his death, the Pope signed a decree to destroy the so-called secret Latin schools for women. The last person questioned about this matter was a novice who could read prayers in a language inaccessible even to the bishop. According to rumors, it was precisely her heart that was torn out and offered as a sacrifice. But now, it was the Pope's own heart that was rotting in the darkness, and no one knew if he had been forgiven.